Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final installment of our Gaza lecture series, co-sponsored by 4 different units at Georgetown University. It's a huge honor and a privilege to introduce Bruno Maçães to you today. Bruno is a philosopher, a public intellectual, and an author who has written powerfully and eloquently about the genocide in Gaza and the failure of the West. He is a New Statesman foreign correspondent where he writes a regular column on global affairs. From 2013 to 2015, he was the Portuguese Minister of European Affairs, where he represented his country in Brussels during the Eurozone crisis, the first Ukraine war, and the Brexit controversy. Bruno Maçães has a doctorate from the Department of Government at Harvard University. He's the author of several important books: History Has Begun, The Birth of a New America, The Dawn of Eurasia, On the Trail of the New World Order, and Geopolitics for the End of Time, From the Pandemic to the Climate Crisis. His forthcoming book, to be published by Cambridge University Press in February, is called World Builders, Technology and the New Geopolitics. We came to know him because of his principled defense of the human and national rights of the Palestinian people and his sharp and principled critique of Western powers and their policy toward Gaza, specifically his critique of Western elites and their silence over the complicity of what's happening in Gaza today. I have to admit, one of the things that really attracted me to Bruno when I first started reading him is he falls into a very small category of public intellectuals who is principled on the 2 big global international events that you're all familiar with, Gaza and Ukraine. Usually, if you're good on Gaza, you're not good on Ukraine, and vice versa. Our guest speaker today is good on both of those issues, and that's one reason why we wanted an extended invitation to him. The title of his talk is Gaza, Ukraine, and the Remaking of Global Order. Please join me in welcoming Bruno Maçães to Georgetown University.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a chart I published with the New Statesman a couple of weeks after October 7th, as I was starting to struggle with a very difficult process, personally even, of making sense of events in Gaza, events in Ukraine, but perhaps more importantly, about the surrounding environment among intellectuals, politicians, journalists, and what seemed to me blatant contradictions in how many people, including friends of mine, were addressing those issues. Let me talk a little bit about the chart and what I'm trying to do here. So it seemed to me that one should, in principle, regard the rights of Palestinians and the rights of Ukrainians through the same lens. We have here peoples that have no doubt about their existence as an independent people, a long history of struggle for national recognition and national freedom. And why were we not applying the same principles in both cases? Why, in fact, were so many people and so many friends of mine doing the opposite, applying 2 different sets of principles to both cases? I was, I think, well prepared to think about these matters because for a year or 2, I had been noticing the enormous similarities between a certain kind of discourse coming out of Moscow and a certain kind of discourse coming out of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. Already we have here a controversial issue. Mm-hmm. I had read Smotrich's infamous manifesto called something like A Decisive Plan, which is in essence, it was published in a few years before October 7th, I think 2019, if I'm not mistaken, but in any case, a few years before October 7th. And the manifesto is, well, in essence, it is a plan of genocide. I had studied it rather carefully and had noticed a striking similarity between the arguments Smotrich, currently the finance minister in the Israeli government, and an apologist both for annexing the West Bank and depopulating Gaza, in his manifesto, he had made an argument that had been made by Putin about the same time. And the argument, in essence, is Palestinians don't exist. They don't exist as a people. They are an invention in order to strike at the heart of Israel. Putin had made exactly the same argument. There is no such thing as Ukrainians. Ukrainians are an invention, he says, originally of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to strike at the heart of Russia. Early on, after the Ukrainian invasion, I had asked a close advisor of Putin's, Sergei Karagano, if he agreed that Ukrainians were not a people and did not exist as a people. And he said, of course I agree. And I asked him then, if they're not a people, why are they fighting the invasion? This was 2 months after February 2022. And he said, well, they fight in small groups so far, but it won't last for long because they don't exist as a people. Turns out he was wrong. And turns out Smotrich is wrong as well. But the constellation of arguments is remarkably similar. It's a negation of nationality, of independence to a people, with perhaps the difference that in the case of Russia, the goal is to assimilate Ukrainians into a triune nationality of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. And in Israel, there is no such attempt to force Palestinians to assimilate an Israeli identity. It's more a plan of expelling them from what one would regard as Greater Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank. One thing I struggled with was to find people that had the same, what I regarded as the same principal position on Ukraine and Gaza. And I discussed this with my editor at the New Statesman. We went through all the possible candidates among intellectuals and among politicians. Among intellectuals, it was suggested that Zizek was a good example. He has had strong arguments in both cases. And there were perhaps a few others, but there were also many cases of people that stood out for the contradictory manner in which they addressed both cases. And I don't like to pick up fights individually all the time, but there's been one fight that I have picked up on social media with Timothy Snyder. It seems to me a blatant case of someone who has spoken about Ukraine in universalist terms as a question concerning humanity as a whole, not a question concerning Ukraine, not a question concerning Europe. And so I think it's fair to ask him, if this is a question concerning humanity as a whole, why have you not expressed a single thought on what is happening in Gaza? Among politicians, I ended up picking Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, simply because his statements have been clear on both cases, but obviously the support that Spain has offered Ukraine does not compare with the support Spain has offered Palestinians. There has been a recognition of the Palestinian state more recently, but obviously there have been sanctions against Israel imposed by Spain. So it's not exactly the same position, but you can see that there is a background of similar principles being applied. Then we have, obviously, the two sides that I think illustrate the contradiction. You have people that regard the Ukrainian struggle as sacred, as representing what is most sacred about humanity, a thirst for freedom. But in the case of Palestinians, they think that struggle should not be fundamentally respected, does not exist, or again, Palestinians do not exist. And you could find many cases. What is interesting about the Westernists is that you can find them everywhere, and even in some surprising places. I've been struggling how the maximum expression of what I call Westernism, you could probably find among the Green Party in Germany, which is nominally a left of center party, but that has really expressed something like the supremacy of Western civilization and regards Israel as part of Western civilization, but the Palestinian movement associated with Iran as an enemy of Western civilization. Anti-Westernists, again, people who are quite ready to regard the Palestinian struggle as, again, representing the best about humanity's aspiration for freedom, But as in the case of Brazilian presidents, Lula da Silva, have not said the same about Ukraine, and on the contrary, are expressing many reservations. It's almost a perfect inversion in these two camps, because Lula will say about Ukraine that it is a fake struggle fundamental that's been inspired by NATO, that has been promoted by NATO, but it doesn't regard it as a genuine Ukrainian struggle. That's why I come up with the names Westernists and anti-Westernists. What is the issue here? It's an issue of defining the fundamental political struggle in terms of who your enemy is. When we talk about these two camps in the diagonal here, the concern is not about principles, it's about who your enemy is. And if your enemy is the West, then you're on the upper left quadrant, and it's a struggle fundamentally against the West. In the case of Ukraine, well, Ukraine represents the West. In the case of Palestine, Israel represents the West. You start from who your enemy is. Those of you who are familiar with Carl Schmitt will recognize the marker, and you define your position in terms of your enemy. And in the case of the Westernists, well, the exact reverse of that. There's a struggle between the West and the rest. We're on the side of the West. Therefore, Ukraine is one of us, and Palestinians are on the other side. Then we have perhaps the most interesting of the quadrants. We have those people who are, because you could even say there is a certain logic, humanly understood logic of siding with your friends against your enemies. But when it comes to what I call the Darwinists, you're not siding with your friends against the rest, you're siding with the strong against the weak. The Hindutva movement in India, represented by the BJP party, has been quite remarkable, very active on social media, and they take the side of Russia in the Ukraine dispute, and they take the side of Israel in the Middle Eastern dispute. And at first I struggled quite a bit with this. Why would you do this? You know, there seems to be something, for someone like me, something difficult to accept in the Westernist, anti-Westernist position. But I could still represent it as a kind of misguided tribalism, that you see justice on your side, but you don't see it on the other side, a kind of blindness. But when you are willfully siding with injustice on both cases, then there seems to be a more fundamental commitment. But and the other example, of course, is the MAGA movement in the US that also seems to have a strong sympathy for Russia. It's not the whole of the Republican Party by any means, but a chunk of the Republican Party has sympathy for Israel and for Russia at the same time. But slowly I actually came to realize that, again, we have the reverse imagery of the Universalists. Whereas in the case of the Universalists, one looks for principles that can apply in all circumstances. And we can talk a little bit later about this universalism. It has to be contextual, has to be careful to differences. It shouldn't be a cookie cutter approach of applying the same ready-made principle. I am concerned about that too. But there's a concern about finding universal principles. And in the case of the Darwinists, there's a concern about not finding any principles, of just recognizing the realities of power, that might is power. So again, the reverse image, there seems to be something quite revealing about this chart that wasn't obvious at first. You could have a long seminar about it. And then I started thinking that, in fact, the Darwinists might be philosophically the most profound group among all of us, that they may be having the intuition of where the world order is heading. Towards a world of might is right, where principles dissolve. Let me stop here, and we can keep the slide there, but I'm going to try to develop this idea now of whether the world order is dissolving or evolving towards something different. I would describe the current moment as a revolutionary moment. A transition from a certain idea of order into a different idea of order. What is a revolutionary moment? I'm going to talk about the three characteristics of a revolutionary moment. That incidentally, I should be forthcoming about this, are the three characteristics that Lenin attributes to revolutionary situations. I don't think this is a particularly theoretical point that Lenin is making. It's a practical point that he was able to make as a careful student of when is a political social situation ripe for revolution, and no one better than Lenin to reflect on that. If you go to Wikipedia, there's an entry called revolutionary situation. That's a Leninist concept, and there's the reference there to the two essays where Lenin talks about this. What are the three characteristics of a revolutionary situation? And again, I'm mentioning Lenin only for the sake of scholarly rigor, because I think these three characteristics are pretty straightforward, and you don't need the theoretical edifice of Marxist-Leninism to get there. The three characteristics are, first of all, the rulers can no longer rule. What does this mean? It means that they no longer have the power to rule. They no longer have the force, the influence, the practical ability to rule. But it also means that they no longer have the knowledge and the skill, which is different from the power, the ability to rule. And it also means that they no longer have the legitimacy to rule, that their rule is no longer widely accepted, but it's in fact resisted. So again, the rulers can no longer rule because they either are no longer powerful enough to rule. That could even be a function of economic variables. They no longer have the legitimacy to rule, and perhaps they no longer have the ability to rule. That's the first characteristic. Second characteristic, the ruled can no longer stand being ruled. They are in rebellion, in open rebellion. But they are in rebellion because their situation is desperate. The ruled can no longer continue to be ruled. It has become existentially impossible for them. And the third characteristic, very important for Lenin, this is the only point where there's a Leninist twist. The ruled are starting to organize among themselves against the rulers. One thing that Lenin understood very well, and the Bolsheviks understood very well, is that it's not enough to have a situation where power is eroding, where the economic, social situation is catastrophic, that without an organized alternative, you will not have a revolution. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because when I think about geopolitics, when I think about world politics today, it seems to me that these categories are extremely illuminating. And all we have to do is to transpose the knowledge we have about revolutions inside countries into a revolution at the level of the global order. And the analogy is simply to make, the rulers are the West, or in particular the United States. I believe there was for a long time a governing coalition of Europeans and Americans. I think the governing coalition has collapsed, and it's been replaced by a single party rule of America. I made this point in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and everyone in the audience was nodding. I think there's awareness there that we have been excluded from the group of the rulers, and perhaps even being demoted to the group of the ruled. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So it is enough to make the analogy between the rulers inside a country with the rulers at the level of global order. Now, can the rulers still rule? Can America still rule? This would be a good title for another talk. Can America still rule the world? And my answer is it can't. And remember the three reasons it can't. As Donald Trump has the knowledge to rule the world, that was the second question. And many people would say no. But the United States still have the power. And do they have the legitimacy? Here, I'll talk a little bit about Ukraine, because I think Ukraine and Gaza fit very neatly into these two questions. For the question, do the United States still have power to rule I think this is a question where the answer has a lot to do with Ukraine. And do the United States still have the legitimate role? It's a different question where I think Gaza is particularly relevant. So let's take the first one. Ukraine, for me, remember that Francis Fukuyama, at the beginning of the Ukraine war said, this is it. This is the real end of history. Finally, it took a while, it took a detour, but it's arrived because Russia launched this insane war. It's going to lose the war. It's going to transform into a Western democracy. China will see this happen and will also give up its illiberal plans. It will also convert. And finally, as I predicted, a little bit late, but as predicted, here it is, the end of history. Now, I was very skeptical of this at the beginning, and I think that skepticism has been justified. The war has become more or less permanent. The United States has been evidently struggling with how to bring it to a conclusion. And the reasons, in my opinion, are directly connected to the erosion of American power, political and economic. I can't give too many examples, not to spend too much time, but let me give you one that I think is quite striking. Russia continues to be able to finance its war. It's able to finance its war because it continues to export oil and gas at the same levels it did before. It's difficult to make an economy collapse when its main predominant source of income is left more or less unaffected. And why was it left unaffected? Because, and I think Putin realized this very well, not to say that he even studied it before the invasion. The world economy has shifted considerably. Other countries have risen in economic importance. India, Indonesia, China, major consumers of energy that were ready to start importing Russian energy. The United States could, for example, have tried to stop those Russian exports to India, Indonesia, and China. Okay, let's forget about China, which might be more difficult. Why didn't the United States threaten India with secondary sanctions in order to stop Indian imports of Russian energy? And then we'd be talking about a potential collapse of the Russian economy. But the Biden administration chose not to. And I know why. The people importing Russian energy and making fortunes are people close to the Modi regime, large oil importing companies in India. People familiar with India here will know the names. I don't need to say them. Biden administration could have threatened the Modi government. It seemed obviously to people in Washington this was imprudent. It would upset, it would anger the Indians, it would perhaps throw them in the arms of the Chinese at a time when we need India to confront China. So what you're seeing is the world order is much more distributed, more difficult for the US to navigate, and then you have to make certain compromises. All right, this is just an example, but I think it's relatively uncontroversial at this point, where most people who know about the situation in Ukraine are much more inclined to say that Ukraine is heading for defeat. And the former Ukrainian defense foreign minister just said in the lunch with the FT that if nothing changes, Ukraine is heading for defeat. This obviously is not the same world that existed 20 years ago. Even in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, I remember the US moved some troops to Tbilisi airport, and Russia immediately rethought its plans of moving on Tbilisi. And an invasion of the kind of Ukraine invasion, if it had been tried 20 years ago, I think the sanctions would probably have collapsed the Russian economy. There would be bank runs, but the world economy is different. Russia had prepared for the sanctions, and the result was quite different. So we see here that American power is much reduced, at least in the sense that it's no longer really possible to impose your desired outcomes on a recalcitrant reality. Now, let's turn to the second question. Is American power still legitimate? And here, I think the question of Gaza is quite relevant, and we get to the important point of what is happening. Now, one of the things I've struggled with when it comes to Gaza is the way propaganda of different kinds and with different sources has taken over the debate. And the problem with propaganda is not only that you don't know what to believe, but if you're a cautious person, as I am, you're very reluctant to base your arguments on facts because you're afraid that the facts you choose turn out to be the wrong ones and will invalidate your arguments. This has contaminated the discussion, and to some extent explains why some people have removed themselves from the discussion, though others have removed themselves just out of plain cowardice. But so I was forced, and it's quite bizarre that we live in this world now in Western societies. I was forced to do some reporting of my own, because then I could be sure that I could make the argument with full confidence. And I think on social media, you see my confidence because I had seen these things as closely as I could. And even though it was impossible to go to Gaza, I went to Cairo. I met many Palestinians who had left Gaza. And just to tell you one story. So I met two siblings that left Gaza in January, 4 months after October 7th. And this is the story. The older brother is 26. He has been married for 3 or 4 years. They had trouble having children. But with the artificial insemination, finally, his wife got pregnant. But one day in November 2023, soon after the war in Gaza started, one bombing in Rafah sent her into shock, and she had a miscarriage. So they lost their child that they have been struggling to have. A month later, another bombing killed Tawfik's the name of the young man, father, as he was working on the family's brick house. Remember, this is Rafah before the Rafah invasion. It was already being heavily bombed. And two sisters were wounded, and in fact, they were found half buried in the rubble. The father was immediately killed. One of the sisters was particularly injured, and she had to be operated in Rafah, but under the terrible conditions, she contracted a bone infection, extraordinarily, exceedingly painful, and she was in danger of losing her life. So Tawfik decided to live with his young sister, and they got a medical certificate, difficult to get, but some people did get it. Across the border, she was operated again in Arish, next to the border. But that operation didn't go well either. And finally, they made it to Cairo, where she was operated for a third time. 1 month later, another bombing in Rafah. It's quite remarkable that this is Rafah before the invasion. Killed Tawfik's brother. Then in May this year, the Rafah border was closed, and suddenly Tawfik, who planned to return and wasn't able to return to Rafah because the border was closed, now receives news from his wife, who had to leave Rafah after the offensive and moved to Mawazi on the beach, in tents. And of course, the tents are being constantly bombed. And Tawfik hears news from his wife in the tents. At this point in the conversation, Aya, the little girl, 9 years old, comes in, and she is limping. I ask her if everything is okay. She says her hip still hurts very much. Perhaps because I don't have children, I'm a bit clumsy talking to her, and I ask her, what do you miss about Gaza? Also because I wanted to write something, and I thought she would say something beautiful about Gaza. She's so shy, she can't say anything, but I insist, and finally she says, I miss my classmates. Now remember, classmates in Gaza are girls, only girls in the madrasa, our age, 8, 9, 10 years old. And I say, oh, I miss them. Perhaps you'll go back to Gaza and you can see them again. And she says, I miss them because so many have been killed. These are 9-year-old girls. You know, the story. And then I leave with the person that was helping me translate. And I'm like, kind of devastated from meeting a girl. And he tells me, this is not even, I mean, I could tell you, Bruno, stories that are much more horrible than this. They're much more horrible. So why have we been defending this? why have we now reached a point where, and I can show you or send you the links, the State Department here in Washington has moved from saying that Israel is not targeting civilians to saying that it is targeting civilians, but it is necessary because those civilians are mixed up with Hamas fighters. This is a doctrine being openly promoted. There is a defense of war crimes. It's quite remarkable. We reached the point, not where war crimes are being excused or where they are being ignored, but they are being defended as a matter of doctrine. This is Miller at the State Department recently arguing that it's very sad that civilians are being targeted, not killed, but targeted. Notice this is an important distinction. What the State Department is saying, and his statements were not corrected, is that civilians are being deliberately targeted, not just as collateral damage, but they are being deliberately targeted because we want to kill some Hamas fighters. And since they are mixed together, we have no alternative. I mean, there must have been a few periods in history where a state has so openly and proudly defended the commission of war crimes. So it's remarkable to me that we have reached this point. My explanation, again, is in terms of the transformations I am talking about here, that as power becomes less legitimate, as power becomes less accepted. And this is a very hard fact to confront, but I think we have to confront it. It also tends to transform itself. If I see an important trend in the debates in Europe and the United States today, it's this transformation in the nature of power, where those exercising power essentially argue that because the world has become so much more threatening to us, we have to let go of the principles and pieties and niceties. We have to let go of the liberal principles that we have. And we have to embrace the nature of power as just brute force. If I see something that is present everywhere in the arguments in Europe and America, in some forms that are more polite and forms that are less polite, is this idea that we have to be tough. Remarkably, this would be a second edition of Orientalism, Said's book. Remarkably, we've now operated a very interesting trick here. Those very traits that we have projected upon the rest of the world, that we were principled, that we were magnanimous, that we were moderate, that we were inclusive, and the rest of the world was brutal, unprincipled, violent, and hateful. This is the story of Orientalism. But now we have decided that we are going to reappropriate the traits that we have projected upon the rest of the world. And now they're going to become our traits. Now, because the world is less hospitable to us, we are going to become unprincipled, hateful, violent, and brutal. Because they are, to a considerable extent, this has been projected by us, because they are unprincipled, brutal. They are animal-like. In order to deal with them in a world of open competition, of the arena, as two Trump advisors said in a famous piece in 2017 in the Wall Street Journal, because we live in the arena, then we have to become like them. And this, I think, is the other transformation that is happening. So we have, at the same time, an America that is less capable of imposing its will, an America that is less able to understand the world, an America that is less legitimate and therefore feels that it has to use other tools of power rather than legitimate power. And that, I think, is the fundamental component of our revolutionary situation.
Great. Thank you very much. This situation that you described about Orientalism Part 2, we're no longer even we're gonna do away with the pretense of universal values and just focus on naked, brutal power. This is something that happened way before Gaza. It's not something that's a function of the war in Gaza. Is it safe to assume that Gaza has laid this bare, just blatantly When did this process of sort of decline begin? I guess that would be the question.
Well, in my I prefer this.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my public interventions over the last year, I get two types of criticism. I get criticism for, and originally I come more from conservative circles. Believe it or not, I was even a fellow at the Hudson Institute here in Washington. I get the criticism from those circles that I am become too radical, and that I am what I say about the West is terribly unfair, and that none of this is happening, not even in Gaza, even though, again, I can tell the story of what I saw in Cairo, and I can tell the story of my conversations with doctors that went to Gaza as a defense against this accusation. And usually when I spend the time telling them what I heard from original sources, they don't have a good rejoinder. But that's one criticism I get. Mm-hmm. Then I get another criticism from people on the left. That's the thing. You get criticized from all sides. That I'm quite naive and stupid, because I'm talking about these things as if they're real, or if they this is some kind of transformation that happened, and I don't realize that the West was always like this. Now, just as with the first criticism, I would resist the second one. I think there is a transformation, and I think if we talk about the Iraq War, I didn't see what I was here. I was in grad school here in Boston. I didn't see this. Those of you who are old enough, you tell me if you disagree, but I didn't see this. I saw, on the contrary, an attempt, which I'm sure was very imperfect, but an attempt, for example, to distinguish between civilians and combatants. But I don't see that attempt here. Here, I see a kind of a mania that doesn't want to be stopped, and therefore finds all kinds of horrible excuses that there are no civilians in Gaza, that the civilians, if they're children, will grow up to be terrorists anyway, might as well kill them now. We see congressmen here in Washington say, kill them all. I have the videos. I don't remember this from the Iraq War. I'm pretty sure it didn't happen. So I think there's a process. There's an evolution. I also don't remember the same level of free speech repression and suppression.
Freedom of speech.
Yeah, freedom of speech. I don't remember at Harvard in 2001, 2003. I mean, many people around me. First of all, there were many enthusiastic supporters of the Palestinian cause who went about very freely on campus defending those ideas. Professors too. There were many people who were critical of the Iraq War. There were lively debates. And I think this time around, it was different. I wasn't here. You'll tell me how it was, but the reports I saw from what happened on campuses seemed to me qualitatively different from what I remember in the past. But it's an important discussion. I just I worry that people who say it's always been like this, they are the quadrant of the anti-Westerns who begin from a certain presupposition, rather than people who are committed to the principles. By the way, and quickly, and I know you're interested in this, but when the events in Syria started to happen a few days ago, I think we saw again the dance of the quadrants, because there were many people that seemed to me to have a good and principled position on Gaza. Although about some of them, I already had my suspicions. Very quickly turned into Assad apologists, because for them, the fundamental thing is to fight the West. And therefore, because Assad is seen as an enemy of the West, they are quite ready to say, well, democracy in Syria is not that important. What is important is that Assad is against the West. So the dance continues. And it's only something very Hegelian. It's only through the whole process that you understand what people stand for. If you stop at a certain moment and you look at what people defend, you might be deceived into thinking that they're defending principles. But no, it's purely contextual. Look at the whole process, shift the context, and see how their position evolves.
Right. Good. Okay. Yeah. Michael, I'll take three hands. Two three, and then we'll go through another round. So Michael, go ahead.
So much for an illuminating talk, and I agree with you that we're seeing a transformation of the international order. I have two big picture questions. First of all, how much do you credit the end of the Cold War in creating this situation, in that there was one sort of illiberal superpower and one superpower that supported this kind of more universalistic position? We see the collapse of that international order starting really after 91. And second, I'm not sure we're seeing a revolutionary situation so much as one of the periodic cycles where, let's say you have universalism and the Enlightenment, followed by Romanticism, positivism, post-positivism, interwar, post-war. Isn't this one of these major cycles that we're seeing?
Yeah, good questions. Look, I was thinking so hard about the second question that I momentarily forget the first.
Cold War.
Yeah, the Cold War, I do think it plays a role, but maybe different from what you have in mind. I seem to sense a certain psychological mechanism where the Cold War is being endlessly replaced, but at the level of fantasy. That we now have to create new Cold Wars all the time. We have to invent imaginary enemies. We are completely seduced by this narrative of two blocks, one made up of the good guys and another made up of the bad guys. This is so in the Cold War, it filtered into the popular culture, that I'm going to go Hollywood for the sake of simplicity, and then it's been fed by that popular culture back into our imaginary. And so today we have this, there's nothing more popular with publishers than this idea of a new Cold War. There's hundreds of books with that title and hundreds of articles. So I would say that it's not so much that the problem is that the Cold War was never over inside our minds. And we tend to, I'm very attracted by applying ideas of psychopathology to world politics. That's maybe a project for the future. We are fixated on that. And we cannot let go of that framework. The world does not make sense without framework. Without that framework, it's just chaos that cannot be perceived. In a Kantian way, we project the framework of the Cold War into a chaotic, disordered reality to make sense of it. And we do it over and over again. And the second question, yes, again, yes, with some slight reservation. That I think what you described was the Western struggle for universality. It was a constant struggle, and sometimes it hit a roadblock, and it tried another road. But I see it as a sort of a permanent, continuous struggle, and I don't find that now. We're not looking for a new kind of universality. It looks to me that we're abandoning it. So in that sense, worse than other crises of universality in the past, which were genuine crises in the process of discovery. But I don't think we're going through a process of discovery. I think it's a rather willful abandonment of that. As I try to express as vividly as I could, there's even a celebratory note that we're finally getting rid of this. Incidentally, I think this is what Trump is all about. There's this celebration of embracing power as power. And this is in your personal life, in your domestic political life, in global politics. The beauty about Trump and why he's been so successful, he has this idea that cuts across everything and explains everything. If only we stop being soft and we embrace. By the way, in that article that I recommend you read by McMaster and Gary Cohn in 2017 in the Wall Street Journal, they actually use this idea of embracing. Let's embrace the violent nature of reality. So, this is not a sort of hesitant search for universality. This is a celebratory abandonment of it.
Second question, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. So I work in Berlin. I work at the German think, but I'm originally from Spain. And my question is, since these two countries' approaches are so different, And I think that's very interesting to me to see actually how different they are. Do you think that we're going to see at some point soon at the European level a more unified approach towards the conflict in Gaza? Because we kind of saw it with the conflict in Ukraine, apart from like some exceptions like Hungary, etc.
No, I don't think so. You must have been very happy to see Pedro Sanchez there, but I don't think so. I think in the case of Ukraine, it was a relatively natural hesitation in the face of a war that was much more dangerous and people that were afraid, to be honest. Countries are afraid. Here, it's not that. Here, it's, in my opinion, I've come to the conclusion, regrettably, that the fundamental reason people are unable to correct their views on Gaza, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. You know, after Sinwar was killed, how can you say Israel is still fighting Hamas? By the way, Israel now says openly that Hamas has been decimated, and no one asks the question, well, who are you fighting then still, every night, every day? And, you know, regrettably, I come to the conclusion that, and this has been very painful for me, because at the beginning, I was so active on social media and trying to write a lot of stuff, because I thought if I communicate or I help communicate what is happening, people will change their minds. But then I came to the conclusion it's not about facts at all. That people are committed to a certain collective fantasy, collective mania, that correcting that mania involves abandoning your whole sense of reality. And so they will only abandon it in the face of a complete crash, which, you know, maybe 2 years from now, the real numbers will come out. We'll find out that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. I mean that is literally, it's entirely possible that 2 years from now, we'll find out that 500,000 people have been killed. And perhaps that will be the crash. But it's not a process of looking at the evidence, discussing, deliberating in Brussels. People have different views. That's not happening at all. You know, I have a sense, let me just quickly say, sort of because I'm trying to make sense of the experience that seems so strange to me. Sometimes I think it's similar to, I'm like in a movie theater watching a film with someone. And then, you know, Matt Damon is going to Mars, and a day later he's in Mars. And I turn to my neighbors and I say, look, the guy went to Mars. It took him 24 hours, even at the speed of light. And they would say, shut up and watch the movie. And, you know, when it comes to Gaza, you know, I turn around and I say, look, according to these doctors, hundreds of children at least have been killed by snipers with shots to the head, precise shots to the head or to the heart. And this has been documented by 30 American doctors with degrees from Harvard and Stanford. And people say to me, shut up, this is not the point. We are watching the destruction of evil by a valiant small country. This is the movie we're watching. Why are you calling attention to the internal inconsistencies? That's not the point of the experience. So regrettably, again, I think we are in the domain of psychopathology and not in the domain of the facts.
At the back, someone had their hand. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask you again about the new situation in the US, all these decades with the college students and the radical pro-Gaza encampments, specifically last May. And I happen to have time on my hands, freedom, and for most of those encampments were shut down in 24 hours, if I'm not mistaken. But at the university yard at George Washington University went on for 14 days. And I was there every day because I'm a journalist and there to support that. But I interviewed a lot of students and I really saw them realizing their own strength. They had 2 weeks to set up that community. And they had movies, they had every kind of posters, food, medical care. And it was just amazing to see that. Now, it was shut down after a couple of weeks, but I'm just wondering, you know, those are some of the top young people in the US. I mean, they're going to the best schools. And I just don't know if you have an inkling of what your opinion would be as, can they start a grassroots movement of some sort? It's not going to be at the top, you know, at the top, it's just impossible. But both presidencies are backing genocide. And so it's got to come, I think, from people. And, you know, I was also a baby boomer. I missed the counterculture of the '60s. I was too young, but I caught it in the '70s, Vietnam, Martin Luther King. And these movements can be very powerful. And I didn't know what your opinions are about, you see some daylight in that for the next year or two.
Mhm.
Yeah, it seemed important because it actually seemed to be the only thing that the Biden administration cared about. They were concerned that this would get out of hand, that would then translate into the Chicago Convention. And if it had continued, it could potentially have had an impact more than anything else. I'm very reluctant to make sweeping comments about what happened because I wasn't here. But I can tell you my sort of general impression. It left me very sad because I thought all those protests were violently repressed. You know, I mean, maybe many people there were shouting the wrong things. I don't think that's essentially the point. The point is that the vast majority of people were moved by good intentions. They want to make a better world. And I couldn't understand why school administrations were repressing them in the way they were. I didn't have much hope from the beginning because I thought they were determined to do this. School administrations were very afraid, terrified themselves. They wanted to put an end to it. They knew their careers depended on it. They have the tools for it, including a lot of more surveillance technology. These social conditions for those kind of movements, I think, are much weaker than they were in the '60s. And, I know a little bit about American universities. I know that many kids here who are paying, I don't even know, I don't think as I was going to say 60,000 a year, but I suspect it's now a lot more with inflation and so on. This may be in my time. And, the parents have struggled to pay. And, it's a very difficult question you have to ask yourself. Am I going to risk being kicked out? And after all, my parents did. In other cases, people that want to have careers. And so, I just think it's shameful that school administrators were putting younger students in the position where they have to choose between the children in Gaza and their own families and not disappointing their families. But in my mind, as I saw those images, this is what I was thinking was behind it. So I thought, this is not going to last. And I guess I was right in a way, because kind of hasn't lasted.
It hasn't been resurrected yet.
Hasn't been resurrected.
I think 3 more questions and then we'll start to wrap it up. One. Pose your first, go ahead, and then we'll see if there's anything else. Go ahead, young man.
My name is Michael, and I'm a recent graduate studying the Middle East. So you concluded in one of your articles earlier this year about Vance and Trump's stance back in July, where Europe might face a heavy responsibility if US withdraw the war effort. And recently, with Germany's 2025 election approaching, and one of the candidates named Frederick Merz leading in the poll, do you foresee any changes in the EU's support for Ukraine? And if the new US administration did abandon Ukraine, how might Europe handle the increased responsibility?
I don't think Europe will be able to. We just don't have the capacities. I'm not sure if I should blame Europeans. Many people do. We did have 3 years to prepare. We did a little. I'm not quite sure that 3 years are enough. I've read, for my new book, I read a lot about the history of military technology. The point US is right now, it took 3 decades to develop. Coming out of Vietnam, what is called the second offset, that technology started to be developed in the '70s, was used in the Iraq War. It's not something you can do in 3 years. So I'm not sure how fair it is to blame Europeans. But as you said in my article, and Nader and I talked about this today, I think the most likely scenario is that Trump is going to abandon Ukraine. He's not going to be able to reach any kind of settlement. He's going to abandon Ukraine. Europeans are not going to be able to step in. Things might become quite ugly. And, in terms of my framework, that is a simultaneous hit to American legitimacy and American power. So again, that's why I don't quite understand why some people continue to see here a triumphant march of liberal America.
Any more questions? 1, 2, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. Knowing that none of us can accurately predict the future, and following up on what you just said, you have a sense of where we're headed, either globally or as a country in the United States, with the change in the power and the order. What do you envision might be the situation?
A process of transition and of disorder, like we've seen in the past, between different world orders, with America not so much retreating, because I guess this is where I can make some kind of contribution that is different from the mainstream opinion. Most people seem to think that the United States will retreat from the world, an isolationist America will leave the world to its own devices. It's an opinion that is very popular in Europe. There's something quite theological about it, that, you know, some people, particularly the generation that is in power in Europe, is the generation from 1989. They have a view of America as a kind of a higher divinity. Liberated Central Eastern Europe, defeated the Soviet Union, brought everyone to NATO. So they have a view of the United States as a kind of divinity. And the worst thing that God can do to us is to abandon us. But since it is fundamentally good, he cannot commit anything worse than retreating from the world. So that's how people in Europe in particular regard the US. And I've been saying you know, the future is relatively easy to predict. And I think in this case, I think it's relatively easy to predict that as American power is more and more contested, that it will become uglier and uglier. So we're not going to have a retreat into isolationism. We're going to have an advance into a form of power that is more direct, more devoid of concerns about legitimacy, more brutal in many respects. And in the case of Europe, it's going to take the form of bullying and humiliation. Then the question is how Europeans will respond. But I can already anticipate, it's already been happening. J.D. Vance said a couple of months ago that either Europe regulates the X platform in a way that we like, and by the way, the X platform is now in government. Either Europe regulates the X platform in a way that we like, or we'll have to revisit our security commitments. Now, Europeans are not going to like this, but to some extent, they won't have much alternative. But what I can say is that this won't look like the transatlantic relationship anymore. The word relationship is going to become italicized more and more. It's a relationship of sorts. That's how I predict the future. Not an isolationist America, but a kind of a you know, you can call it unilateralism, but you know, that's even a kind of a euphemism. I think we'll see a power that is more naked and raw.
Okay, someone at the back, yeah, go ahead. Could you speak up? We can't hear you here.
What do you think, you know, we, especially as students, can do, specifically with Gaza?
Specifically, I didn't hear the word.
With
Gaza.
With
Gaza.
Gaza.
I mean, how do you see it going?
Look, as I said, I tend to think that the root of the problem is not, you know, I didn't talk about the Israel lobby. I didn't talk about the military-industrial complex. I talked a lot about ideas and perceptions and fantasies. So I actually think people who can organize discussions, publish things, even in small newspapers, are making a huge contribution. Because I think the root of the problem is at the level of perception and at the level of deliberate misinformation, propaganda, and lying, because there's also a lot of that. So in a way, that might be an optimistic note of the very few that I will convey today, that there's a lot you can do. I mean, publishing an article in a school newspaper is an enormous contribution. I'm not a big believer in boycotting Starbucks, as people all over the world are doing. I don't quite see the logic of this. But to get into the fight of ideas, with intelligence, by the way, because it's not enough, you know, don't open your flanks to the people that are trying to come after you. Be strategic, join the fight, but do it in a clever way. That's my suggestion.
Very good. Bruno, thank you for being here today and talking about a topic that has gotten very little treatment in the public debate over Gaza, and that's the international relations repercussions of what this moment means for our world, what it means for the United States. It's actually a unique and original contribution. And I want to ask the audience to join me in thanking you for being here to lay out your argument.